we will be looking at the adolescence of witchcraft. And this is basically the period from the 1960s to the 1980s. I was around during the 70s and 80s, but I wasn't involved in Wicca until 1991. But I can certainly remember some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so actually we start with the 1950s, and here we have a picture of Gerald Gardner in his witchcraft museum at the Witches' Mill on the Isle of Man. And a friend of mine had a fantastic story of when he was a very small boy. He went to the museum, and his birthday is on Samhain, the 31st of October. And he was wandering around the museum and he found a cauldron, and there was something nearby, like a wand or something, and he picked it up and started pretending to stir the cauldron, going, "I'm a witch, I'm a witch." And this elderly gentleman with a shock of white hair patted him on the head and said, "Yes, I'm sure you are, my boy." So there he was, blessed by Gerald Gardner himself. And I'm very, very envious of my friend, as you can imagine. Anyway, back to Gerald Gardner and the so last time we looked at the last thing we looked at was the legalization of witchcraft in 1951. So as you can see from this list, Gerald Gardner's first two books on the subject were published before the legalization of witchcraft. So they were both fictional. Now, 1939, A Goddess Arrives isn't really about witchcraft as such. It's about a pagan character from antiquity who goes to the island of Cyprus. And when Gerald arrived on the island of Cyprus, he had a profound experience and believed that he had been there in a previous life. And this story is kind of based on what he could remember of that previous life. So it's very interesting. I haven't got around to reading it yet, so I can't tell you much more about it, but there's a wonderful Wikipedia page about it. In 1949, he published the novel High Magic's Aid. Now I have read this, and it is quite a fun read. It's based on Margaret Murray's hypothesis that there was an extant pagan witch cult in the medieval period. So obviously take with a bit of a pinch of salt. Anyway, it's a fun read, and it concerns the adventures of a witch and her attempts to get initiated. If there's a certain chapter that if you're a kind of no spoilers, I don't want to know what the initiations involve, you might need to kind of skip over that chapter. But anyway, it's definitely a good read, and I enjoyed it. So yeah, the Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1951, largely at the instigation of the Spiritualist Church, because it was the witchcraft and fraudulent mediums. One of spiritualists, Helen Duncan, was the last person to be prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act, and so that's why the spiritualists were interested in getting it repealed. And although Winston Churchill was an extremely dodgy character in many ways, he was one of the people who was instrumental in pushing that legislation through. So despite his legacy of racist nastiness, Churchill did a good thing there. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you very much. Okay, so basically in 1952, Doreen Valiente joined Wicca, and this was clearly to be a very important event in the history of Wicca, as she rewrote a lot of the liturgy. And she had seen, I think, an article in a magazine, and wrote to Gerald, as he was on the Isle of Man already by this time, and so she wrote to him there and she was initiated in 1953, which coincidentally was the end of rationing in the UK. So rationing had lasted another 8 years after the end of the war. I know this because I have my grandma's ration book, and it is dated 1953. So anyways, very important event. And in 1959, Gerald published The Meaning of Witchcraft. And both that and Witchcraft Today are a fascinating read, because although Gerald Gardner is not the Messiah, he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. As you will find out if you read the excellent biography of him by Philip Heselton. So basically, although he's not like the Messiah of witchcraft or anything, it's well worth reading both those books to find out what he was thinking when he founded Wicca. And it's a good counteractive to a lot of the nonsense that gets talked about Wicca, like the idea that Wicca is duotheist, and the idea that it has one god and one goddess. In actual fact, an awful lot of Wiccans are polytheist and regard the horned god and the moon goddess as patron deities of Wicca, or Wicca as an especial cult of those two, and not the only deities that exist. So I thought I'd clear that up. And in fact, if you read Witchcraft Today and The Meaning of Witchcraft, they quite clearly make it obvious that the witches thought there were many gods, and so did Gerald. So there you go. Anyway, personal hobby horse there, because I'm a polytheist, and and I know lots of atheist Wiccans and lots of pantheist Wiccans. You can have any theology and be a Wiccan. You don't need to subscribe to any specific theology. Many witches are animists, for example, and many Wiccans are animists. So yeah, there. Right. So this is from a talk that Doreen Valiente gave on in 1997 at Fairfield Halls in Croydon for the Pagan Federation Conference. And I know this because I was there. I'll put the link in the comments when I'm done, because you can read the whole thing. It's really great. Anyway, what she said about the 1950s is very telling, because I think we need, in our age of, we can buy any witchy book we want off the internet, and you can wander into mainstream bookshops and there's a ton of books on Wicca and witchcraft and the occult. That just was not the case in the 1950s. It was a lot harder to get hold of stuff. So she said, people today have no conception of how uptight and repressive society was back in the 1950s, when old Gerald first opened up the subject of witchcraft as a surviving old religion. You could not go into a shop then and buy a pack of tarot cards or a book on the occult without getting curious looks, and usually a denial that they stocked any such things. There were no paperback books on the occult except such things as Old Moore's Almanac and very popular stuff such as How to Read Tea Leaves. Serious books on the subject were only obtainable second-hand at very high prices. The mentality of the period was perfectly illustrated by the famous inquiry made by a distinguished lawyer in the course of the trial about the publication of D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, when he quite seriously asked the jury, "Would you allow your servants to read this book?" There was a built-in assumption that ordinary people were not entitled to read what they liked or think what they liked, and still less to do what they liked. Hence, of course, old Gerald's Witchcraft Today, first published in 1954, so he wrote it in 49, but it was published in 54, made all the more impact. His publishers, Riders, were really sticking their necks out in publishing it, And it was, I believe, only after having the book carefully edited by Ross Nichols, who was the founder of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, that they agreed to do so. Even such established writers as Dion Fortune came up against this barrier of prejudice. She had to publish her most famous piece of fiction, Sea Priestess, herself, because no publisher in her day would touch it because of its references to moon magic and witchery. And, you know, the 60s created such a transformation in society that we are post 60s, obviously, and people who can remember the 1950s, which does not include me, will tell you that the 60s were a massive transformation in every sphere of life, really. So the thing about what was so special about the 60s, so in the late 60s, people started going on strike. Students went on strike. Students refused to obey the curfew in their universities. They had sit-ins, and there was a bit of a revolution going on in morals and manners, and it was the death of deference to authority. So, you know, it's very transformational time. However, because of this transformation, we tend to forget that the early 60s were really quite like the 50s. 60s counterculture didn't really get going until probably 64 at the earliest. And we obviously get the hippies and Woodstock and, you know, the Summer of Love in 1967, and very important, the civil rights movement. The fact that, you know, the Montgomery bus boycotts, the Selma March, all those marches in the US for civil rights, not forgetting the Stonewall riot, which, as we know, was started by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, two trans women. The peace protests against the war in Vietnam, really, really important. And of course, the rise of feminism, because in the 50s they were feminists, but they were like kind of regarded as fringe. And now we start getting the beginnings of second wave feminism. And in the pagan sphere, we have Green Egg magazine, and there was also the Church of All Worlds, which was based on a novel by Robert Heinlein, founded by two guys at university. And then they discovered that they'd actually, although they started it as a kind of a spoof religion because they didn't want to be forced to go to church, so they were like, well, we're doing our own thing, we're doing our own church. And they actually found that they had contacted something numinous, and so the religion of the Church of All Worlds, which I believe is still going, was born. And so yeah, there's some really interesting developments in the 60s. I thought I'd, for my illustration for this slide, this is a McCall's pattern for a Halloween costume. And I just thought it was kind of hilarious that, you know, this is the sort of, I suppose this is the beginning of cute witches as opposed to the, you know, obligatory green face paint and warts and a big pointy nose. We've now got a cute little girl dressed as a witch, slightly grumpy looking pumpkin on her head. So very interesting transition here. And obviously we've got some fairies and angels and whatnot in the background there too. I don't know if I actually remember McCall's patterns like this when I was growing up, so sort of evoked a feeling of nostalgia for me. So kind of cute. But anyway, yeah, the 60s were a massive transformational time. Obviously, first moon landings in 1969, and that gave everybody the perspective that, hey, the Earth can be seen as a whole. That picture of the Earth from the moon was really transformational. Just seeing the Earth from space, so you could see the whole planet and realize there's no boundaries. You know, those national borders are incredibly artificial. And obviously the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of colonial orders were being overthrown, and a lot of African countries gained their independence from the colonial oppressors, and so there was a massive transformation in that sphere as well. So highly, very interesting period, well worth the study. And obviously today we kind of take the mickey out of hippies and go, "Ooh, hippies, man, wow," and imagine that they were all stoned out of their minds, which they probably were a lot of the time. But the hippie philosophy is a serious philosophy that talks about autonomy and getting in touch with nature and being true to values, living sustainably. So it's not just kind of a load of stoners hanging around in the field. It is much more than that. And it's very intertwined with the values of the pagan movement. So again, something worthy of study. So on to the 70s. And in the 70s, of course, we have, I haven't listed it here, but we have the punk movement, which was very much a reaction to the hippie movement in a way. And the punk movement's super important as well, in that it was a bit more nihilistic and very much more anti-authoritarian than the hippie movement. But going back to the history of paganism as opposed to more general culture, in the 70s we get the explicit linkage of witchcraft and feminism, and we have the WITCH, which is still going amazingly, and it was a feminist collective founded in October 1968. So again, that revolutionary year, 68. It's also when May 68, there were the student revolts in Paris. So which stood for Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and various other things. They made the acronym stand for a lot of other things. And it was a feminist movement that identified the older theory that the medieval persecution of witches was an anti-woman thing, and they also took the statistic that Matilda Jocelyn Gage had claimed that 9 million women died. There weren't 9 million women in Europe at any one time, probably at that time. So it's more likely to have been somewhere around 140,000, which is still a lot. Because what Matilda Jocelyn Gage did was she took the statistics from Bamberg, which was the most intense witch persecution area, and she took them from the most intense decade of witch persecution and multiplied up from that, which, but 9 million doesn't work as a number. But anyway, so WITCH is still going. They were protesting recently. There's photographs of them in Boston in 2017, and they take a very feminist approach to all of this, and it's a very interesting organization. So also the 70s were really when environmental concerns became a bit more mainstream. I mean, I remember my mum recycling stuff and people saying, and I think, it wasn't mainstream to recycle stuff, although people did save their milk bottle tops. I think after the energy crisis of 1973, it's probably when thinking about saving energy and not polluting stuff and worrying about destruction of habitats and starting to think about recycling became more important. Also worth noting that in the 1970s, when you bought a bottle of pop or soda or fizzy drink, whatever you call it, where you come from, you could take the bottle back and get get the deposit back on the bottle. Now you can, in Canada, you can do that. You can still do that with beer cans. You can take the beer cans to the beer store and get a couple of cents back on each can. I guess it's probably 10 cents a can or something. But anyway, there should be more of that, because reuse is actually better than recycling. Gosh, that was a massive digression. A little bit obsessed with the environment and climate change. I think also the popularity of Lord of the Rings probably helped immensely in the nascent pagan movement at this time, because people read it and went, "Oh, magic and elves," and again that environmental sensibility. So I think that that was really, really important. And also important would be TV shows with tarot and magic in them. There were lots in the 70s. I think there was one called Tarot, and of course Bewitched. I think that was available in the 70s. And the picture for this slide is Patricia Crowther in December 1971. And this was actually, it's archived on Getty Images. So I'm not sure where this picture was published, but I thought it was rather splendid. Hey, the 1980s. So here we have Susan Sarandon in Witches of Eastwick, which was made in 1987. It was funny actually, because I tried to think of witchy films that were made in the 80s, and every time I thought of a film, it turned out to have been made in the 90s. But Witches of Eastwick, which is a great film, was made in the 80s. So there you go. It's also got some good in-joke references to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So it's a fun film. I like it a lot. And the book's good as well. Anyway, so the 80s. At this point in the development of the witchcraft revival, we get more tie-in with second wave feminism. So second wave feminism can be, well, first wave feminism, which was sort of late 19th century up to, I guess, the 40s and 50s, was concerned with getting women legal rights, like the right to vote, the right to a divorce, the right to own property after they were married, that kind of stuff. And second wave feminism is more about trying to identify what is different about women from men. And there were many strands in second wave feminism, and it is quite a complex thing. And there were people in second wave feminism who were talking about gender and trans inclusion and stuff that we would think of as third wave feminism. However, a lot of prominent second wave feminists were kind of anti-men, and therefore also anti-trans women, although obviously trans women are women, but not according to some second wave feminists. So anyways, one of the prominent, there's some prominent second wave thinkers would be, goodness, can't think of her name. Mine's gone blank. Oh well. But anyways, so the second wave feminists were kind of essentialist in thinking about what a woman is, and they tended to kind of take all the things that patriarchal thinkers had said about women, like, nurturing mothers, that kind of stuff, and where patriarchy would denigrate those things, second wave feminism would go, this is a good thing, which of course is true, but it doesn't mean that that is the essential characteristic of what makes somebody a woman. I am not the most nurturing person in the world, and as far as I can tell, well, I am actually non-binary, but as far as I can tell, I am female, biologically at least. So I think that in many ways that particular flavor of second wave feminism did us a disservice because it narrowed the definition of what it meant to be a woman, and it really wasn't much fun. And it's really very anti-kink and anti-trans, and it's kind of boring. And also at this time we have Dianic Wicca and lesbian separatism, and I kind of put those on the same bullet point because to me they are pretty well intertwined. Dianic Wicca was founded by Z Budapest, and it basically worships the goddess only, and it's very entwined with the ideas of lesbian separatism, and not really surprising that it turned out to be trans excluding as well. On a more positive note, we have Starhawk and reclaiming. So Starhawk was trained by Victor and Cora Anderson of the fairy tradition, and she created reclaiming out of that background, and it's very consciously political and liberatory and green and much more. They show up to political protests and protest against industrialization and pollution and nuclear power and nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. So, and in the UK, of course, in this period, we have the Greenham women's protests, which were at an airbase where there were nuclear weapons stored in a state of readiness for use. And there was a very important development in British feminism was the Greenham women's camp and how that worked and how it panned out. And I think the other key thing in this period is the satanic panic, because during the 70s and 80s, there had been a hardening of evangelical Christianity, and it took on the idea that there were lots of Satanists around, and that those Satanists were going around eating babies and whatever. Now, the Christian right, or the evangelical right, far right, if you like, put out videos and misinformation on this topic, such that there was a massive panic that this kind of activity was widespread, and that and of course Wiccans and pagans got tarred with the same brush, and so there were people's children taken away, and I mean, actually some Quakers in the Hebrides had their children taken away, and some people in Rochdale, a group of women in Rochdale had their children taken away. None of them were actually Wiccan or indeed Satanist or anything else. And I do know a Wiccan who was refused access to his child on the basis of the satanic panic. It has, of course, been thoroughly debunked, and there's an excellent book about it. Again, forget the name of the book, but it's easy enough to find, by a psychologist or sociologist of the day who analysed the dynamics of the satanic panic and showed how it was similar to previous witch persecutions like the Salem witch trials and other similar panics. So interesting period. And in fact, I believe that sadly there are evangelicals and fundamentalists out there who are still being inculcated with the idea that witches worship the devil and eat babies. Now, of course, the question, there are witches out there, are Satanists out there who identify as witches, and there are witches who would call their their version of the horned god they would actually refer to as the devil, but they don't mean the same guy as the Christian devil. They mean the anti-authority figure who is dancing around in the woods having a good time, right? It's not the ultimate principle of evil, right? Anyway, so I don't want to throw Satanists under the bus, because there's some very nice Satanists out there. And in fact, there are three types of Satanists. There's philosophical Satanists, based on anarchist ideas. So one example of that would be Lucian Greaves and the Satanic Temple in the US, who promote freedom of religion and freedom from religion, in the sense that, you know, they are very much for keeping abortion legal, for example. So that's one flavor. And then there was there's the version that worships the adversary, so like the Egyptian god Set, or indeed Lucifer, or any other adversary figure that exists. And finally, there is a version that actually does worship the Christian devil, Christian Satan. That is actually the smallest group. You are much more likely to find philosophical Satanists like the Satanic Temple, or Setians, you know, people who worship the adversary. And of course, there are good philosophical reasons to do that, because if the church is all about repressing sexuality and you know, preventing people having a good time and mucking around in the woods, dancing around maypoles, and, you know, having it away on May morning, then, you know, if the church says, hey, there's these people over here and they're worshipping like a guy who tells you to have a good time, well, what are you going to do? You're going to go worship the guy who tells you to have a good time, right? And that's what I think the impulse towards, you know, devil worship is actually all about, for the most part. So, you know, the satanic panic really just has no basis in reality whatsoever. Anyway, there you go. I suppose I should have mentioned as well that the Pagan Federation was found I should have mentioned it on the previous slide. The Pagan Federation was founded in 1971 to counteract misinformation about paganism from sources like far-right evangelicals, and is still going, and is an organisation worth your time and support. And that's in the UK, obviously. Sadly, there is no, well, there's the Covenant of the Goddess in North America, and also check out Pagan Federation International, which does a very good job of countering misinformation and sharing good information in many different countries. So, further reading, and I realized I mentioned a couple of books during the presentation that I could have put on the further reading page. So obviously check out Philip Heselton's books, biographies of Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente. The Doreen Valiente biography is very good, and it's available from the Doreen Valiente Foundation shop. There will be a web address for that in a future slide. And his biography of Gerald Gardner is very good, and also the New Forest Coven, In Search of the New Forest Coven, which is his latest book, which is available from Phoenix Flames. So I think her Hidden Children, The Rise of Wicca and Paganism in America by Chas Clifton is a very good read, very informative. Explains how Wicca and paganism started off in North America, and talks about the links with the concept of nature religion and transcendentalism. So quite interesting. Now, Lid Off the Cauldron is not a history book per se, but it was written in the 1980s and it's just been reissued. And it gives a really good insight into what people were thinking, or what Wiccans were thinking in the 1980s. So well worth your time. And I found this pretty handy potted history of Wicca on history.com. Goes through a lot of general details, which will give you a good overview of the topic. So just wanted to draw attention to my other videos. So Witch's Mirror episode 4 deals with witchcraft in antiquity. Episode 5, medieval and early modern periods. And episode 6, the rebirth of witchcraft. And my next video will be, as this has been the adolescence of witchcraft, the next one will be the coming of age of witchcraft, and will take us up to the present day. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you will check out my books, Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation. They are available from the Doreen Valiente Foundation online shop, which is shop.doreenvaliente.org. And on the cover of Dark Mirror, we have a photograph taken by Doreen Valiente of a witch mirror, with a lovely background of stars. And they are reissued in a new edition. You can get them in hardback or paperback. The ebook will be coming soon. And they are, again, not about history. They are about the concept of the inner work and how to use witchcraft to transform your life along the lines of embodied spirituality. And I hope you will enjoy them. And I will see you next time. Blessed be.